during the dot-com era, where I would have been building web applications and deploying them manually into production. Now, when I say manually, I really mean manually. That would have included taking my source code, copying it onto a 3.5-inch floppy disk, if you're old enough to remember what they are, and going across town with that in my pocket and physically sticking it into a server in a rack to deploy my code. Now, I was able to get away with that at the time because, frankly speaking, the applications were quite simple. However, sadly, guys, those simple, happy times are now behind us. And application developers like me are dealing with a mountain of complexity. And it's getting to the point where the infrastructure that we're deploying our code on is more complex than the actual code itself. So we have this challenge ahead of us as an industry, all of us. How do we handle that complexity in the infrastructure? How do we manage that? And more importantly, how do we automate that at scale? That's what we're going to talk about today. And I would say a secondary goal is, how do we make that simple? Now, I'm sure like many of you over the years, I've evaluated many different tools. And my criteria for evaluating those tools has always been the same. Does this tool make my life easier? Does this tool make the life of my team easier? And that's always been the smell check that a tool has always had to pass before I'd start using it every day. Now, during that discovery process, one tool that did pass the smell check for me was Ansible. I started using Ansible around 2013. Now, Ansible at that stage was not even version 1. It was really like a beta product. And, there were a few challenges with getting up and running with it. You had to check out the source code from the master branch on Git and install it that way. But there was something interesting there, and I've continued to use it ever since. Now, I'm going to talk about Ansible in quite a bit of detail today, but let's just say for now, as a user, I've been there from the very beginning. Later on in my career in 2017, I joined UBCube, which is where I am today. And the team of engineers that I'm working with, many of which are a lot smarter than me, are building an automation solution that a younger version of me 20 years ago could have only dreamed about. I'll talk about that later on, and I'll also include a live demo. But before I get to that, I want to go back to Ansible and talk about Ansible in a bit more detail. So let's get going. So let's imagine we have a fictional user of Ansible, and they're getting up and running with Ansible for the first time. So they're going through that onboarding process, and they're learning the tool, and they're getting familiar with it. What they find is Ansible at the beginning is actually quite a low barrier to entry. It's very easy to install. You can get up and running quickly. You can start building simple automations. You can start doing configuration management with templates quite quickly and get up and running. What the user may find, however, is as they progress into that onboarding process, they can start to hit some challenges, and that can start to slow them down. I want to talk a little bit about those kinds of challenges in my experience and the kinds of issues that would have hit, which I think will be familiar to other Ansible users. So firstly, Ansible on the CLI has no built-in role-based access control or RBAC. So instead, what you're doing is you're going to leverage the Linux capabilities. So you're going to use Linux user accounts to wrap your playbooks and try to use that to control who can do what and who can run what, etc. Now, that's obviously not very convenient. It's a little bit cumbersome, but it can work. Now, if you're working on your own, so if that user is independent, working by themselves, that's not an issue. But if they find that they need to share their playbooks with other members of their team or even the wider organization, they can start to run into some problems there. Another implication when you start talking about multi-user scenario with Ansible is how the playbooks themselves are structured. So that user is going to want to try to structure them in a way that enables ease of maintenance, ease of reuse. They're also going to have to think about source control management. How do they test the playbooks? Do they have automated tests? Um, how do they package the releases of the playbooks themselves and deploy them? Because after all, it is code. So in the worst case scenario, if there isn't discipline in that user's team, they can end up in this situation where so-called code rot starts to creep in. And what that basically means is a playbook can stop working over time simply because of neglect. So again, you don't have enough test coverage, or some dependency has changed that playbook requires, and you go to run the playbook after a while. It used to work in the past, it doesn't work anymore. Okay, so it really requires good processes and good practices and hygiene within the team to make sure that that code rot situation doesn't start to raise its ugly head. Some organizations also can be quite hero driven. So by that I mean you can have a situation where you've got a one-to-one mapping between the engineer who wrote the playbook and the playbook itself. Now that's fine if that particular hero is available and is online. However, if they're not available and the wider team doesn't understand some complicated playbook that's required to manage the infrastructure in production, again, you can imagine in that situation where you can start to run into problems. So why do we see these challenges arising with tools like Ansible, Chef, Puppet, Terraform, etc.? We have to start looking at this from an architectural perspective and try to figure out, why we're seeing these patterns. So if you look at Ansible, we can see it's got a framework in place, but it's quite a flat framework. There's not many layers between, your playbook that's got your automation code and the infrastructure that it's managing. So there isn't much of a buffer in between those two things to protect you or to isolate you from changes at the infrastructure level. And as we all know, changes at the infrastructure level are inevitable. Okay, there's nothing that we can do there. Vendors will bring out new versions of APIs, new patches will come out, and so forth. So at that infrastructure level, you're always going to be dealing with a certain amount of change. You need to have a shock absorber in place that when you have those changes at that lower level, that the higher level automation code still remains relevant and still remains evergreen. So what we can see here then is we can see that we need to improve upon this. We need to take the lessons from that generation of tools, and we need to bring that forward into a newer generation. We need to keep the good stuff. There's a lot of good stuff there that we need to retain, but we need to see how we can build upon that from an architectural perspective. So this is exactly the challenge that we set ourselves in the engineering team in UBCube. And we literally went back to the drawing board on this one to see what exactly we wanted to do from a design perspective. So we set ourselves a number of goals. The first goal, obviously, was we wanted to decouple the infrastructure from the automation and make that gap in between wider to provide some buffer and some protection in between. So we start off with an integration layer. And within that integration layer, we had some additional goals that we wanted to achieve. We all, as hiring managers within the industry, we all have this challenge of when you have a lot of integration, you have a lot of infrastructure, a hybrid infrastructure that you need to manage. So you may have, for example, on-premise cloud, you have public cloud, you have physical hardware, you have a lot of stuff, a lot of complexity. And what we found is as managers, it's very hard to build an operation team and hire in the experts who know all of those various different things. Okay, that's a big challenge to hire those experts and retain them. So what we try to do at that integration layer is say, can we make that as simple as possible so that a non-expert user could still use the interface and still be able to configure things in an easy and an intuitive way. Now, then we move up to that higher layer, which is the automation. We had a number of goals here as well. From a design perspective, there's a couple of things we wanted to achieve. We started to realize that automation means different things to different people. Okay, so there's different kinds of users. One user wants to have a very simple user experience. They want everything to be graphical. They want it to be as simple as possible. Other kinds of users we can say are like power users. They want to get into more detail. Maybe they're a developer. They're comfortable doing a bit of scripting. So they want to have more control over their automations. So we wanted to build a solution that would solve both of those needs. Okay. So let's see how we achieve that. So what you see on screen now is what we call our integrated automation platform. This is at the heart of MS Activator, which is the product from UbiCube that we've been building. I'm going to explain to you the different layers of this architecture to give you a feel for why we laid it out in this way and how we believe it helps that scalability via more abstraction and more decoupling. So let's start at the bottom. At the bottom, we have our infrastructure that we want to integrate. And the closest thing to the infrastructure is the adapter layer. The adapter layer has one simple job. It's to get you a connection to the thing that you want to manage. Okay. And just like Ansible, it's agentless. We're not using any special software or special protocols. So whatever protocol the host supports, be it REST, be it SSH, be it whatever, we will use that protocol and we will load in the appropriate adapter from the library. Now, once we have that connection established, we then want to do something with it, obviously. So this is where the microservices layer comes in. The best way to think about the microservices layer is it's like an API that's going to wrap the infrastructure. And it's going to wrap the infrastructure in a very simple API, which is based on CRUD, which I'm sure you're familiar with: create, read, update, delete. We also have that I on the end, which is a special case, which is import. So apart from creating configurations on the infrastructure, we can also import configurations back into the MSActivator database, which is super convenient where you have a brownfield deployment and there's already configurations in place on the infrastructure. You just want to discover those and import them back in. The microservices layer is literally a REST API. So what that means is you can obviously drive all the infrastructure via the portal UI, and I'm going to show you that in the demo. But you can also call things directly via that REST API. So you can think about it as being a single master API that's going to manage all of your infrastructure from all of your different vendors, regardless of the protocols and APIs that's used at the lower levels. So that's obviously very, very powerful. Now, once we have everything integrated together in the infrastructure, we're then, of course, going to want to automate and automate at scale. The first part of that journey is the workflow library. Now, the workflow library would be comparable to Ansible playbooks. It's some kind of script that you're going to use to carry out an action. So this is where you're going to put in your business logic, your classic if then else scenarios. And as you know, if you're an Ansible user, Ansible uses YAML to achieve this. What we use is we use either PHP or Python. And it's up to you as a developer to choose which language you want to use. We do provide an SDK for each language. So we have a built-in support for common activities like provisioning a host or creating user accounts, the day-to-day stuff. But beyond that, if you're a Python developer, for example, we're just giving you full Python. There's no restrictions. If you want to import third-party libraries, you can do so, for example. The workflows have a number of benefits on top of the microservices. Apart from also being able to be called via REST, of course, there's a few other ways you can call them. We also have an assurance module. So basically, we can actively monitor the infrastructure. Maybe something goes wrong, an alarm gets raised. That alarm can call a workflow, and that workflow can hopefully fix that issue. So you end up having closed loop assurance, which is obviously great if you're the engineer who's on call that night. It's much better to have the issue heal itself rather than you get a pager and obviously have to get out of bed at 3 a.m. The final place where we can call the workflows from is the BPM, and that's the top layer of the integrated automation platform. Now, the BPM is for those users who want that simple automation experience. They want something that's highly abstract, code-free, and at this stage, really what we're talking about is a drag and drop interface where you can literally drag and drop components from the lower layers of that framework and stitch them together visually into a use case that's relevant for you. So as you can imagine, when you start from the bottom where you're dealing with a lot of details about APIs and so on, and as you go through those layers right up to the top, by the time you get to the top, all those details start to disappear. And really all you're focused on at this stage is what you want to do at a business level. Okay? So later on, I'm going to show you a demo and I'm going to make that more real. But let's move on for now. So let me recap what we've discussed so far, because I've covered quite a bit of ground. So firstly, we can say that scalability is impossible where you're in a situation where changes that happen to the infrastructure enforce systematic changes to your automation code. In other words, bringing it back to the Ansible example, when those inevitable changes happen in your infrastructure, ideally, you don't want to be in a situation where you need to go back and change your playbooks. That's something that we want to avoid. How we avoid that is we can leverage that integrated automation platform approach where we have a degree of decoupling that breaks that interdependence between those two worlds. We always want to have evergreen code. So how we achieve this is by having that decoupling where even when something changes at that lower level, the automation code at the higher levels still remains relevant. Now, I'm going to leave you with one thought from one of my favorite authors, which is a science fiction author, Arthur C. Clarke, which I'm sure you're aware of. He's also a futurist. Arthur said, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. I love this quote. For me and for my team, automation is magic, and it should be magical to the user. They shouldn't have to worry about the details about how it works. It should just work. Okay, so let me move on to the demo. So let me set up this demo for you. I have a few aims I want to achieve with this demo. I want to make that integrated automation platform real. And I think the best way to make something real is via something live, a real use case. The use case I'm going to use is very simple. And it's obviously based on Ansible because that's part of the topic for today. So what we're going to do is we're going to embrace Ansible in that integrated automation platform. And then by embracing it, we can then extend it and add additional utility and functionality on top. And hopefully that will become clear as I go through the demo. Now, let me explain the architecture of the demo. So firstly, everything that I'm going to show you today is running locally on my laptop in a series of containers. So we have Docker containers running MS Activator itself, and then we have a number of containers that we're going to manage in the demo. The first of these is we have a host that's running Ansible. So here we have the Ansible down here on the left-hand side. You can imagine this is an Ansible server that you've already got some playbooks there. Maybe you've put a lot of the work into those. You want to keep them, okay? They're providing utility. Now, in my example, I've got a playbook here, which is going to manage a firewall. It's just an example. I don't want you to focus on that. Obviously, your playbooks can do different things. On the right-hand side, then, we have this Linux server where our firewall is running. So that's the one that we're going to change the configuration on during the demo. So that's going to be the first half of the demo. I'm just going to show you Ansible doing what Ansible does. For the second part of the demo, we're then going to introduce MSActivator into the equation. And I'm going to show you how we can actually manage both sides of this equation. So we're going to use microservices from that framework to manage both of these things. We're going to use one microservice from the library to manage the Ansible. So we're going to use that to discover playbooks and, more importantly, execute playbooks. And then we're going to use another microservice from the library to manage the firewall itself directly. So this is where we can do create, read, update, delete, import on the policies within that firewall. Okay, so let's get started. Let me start with Ansible. Okay, so I have two CLIs open, as you can see. On the left-hand side, I have my Ansible, which is my local Docker running an Ansible server. And then on the right-hand side, I have my local Docker Linux running the firewall that we want to manage. So let's see what that looks like. So first of all, on the Ansible side, I have a directory with a playbook inside. Now, I'm a bit lazy for the demo. I've only got one playbook, but obviously you could have hundreds or even thousands of playbooks in there, okay? For now, we just have one. It's a simple one. It's going to update some policies on the firewall. So on the Linux side, we have our firewall, and we already have one policy in place, okay? So we already have a policy in place on port 2001. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to run the playbook and I'm going to add a second policy. Now, if you're an Ansible user, this is all going to seem very familiar to you. So your apologies if this seems pretty basic, but I just wanted to show that we've got a fully integrated Ansible environment that we're working with. So I'll go ahead and execute that playbook. And Ansible tells me it's connected to my Linux server and it's applied some changes and it's gone green, so it's worked. Okay, perfect. Let's confirm that it worked. So here I can see with my playbook, I've added a second policy down below there. Great, so far so good. This is pretty basic stuff. I've got an Ansible environment, brownfield, everything is connected together. For the next part, it's going to get a bit more interesting. We're going to introduce MS Activator. So the first thing I'm going to show you, this is the login screen for MS Activator that I have running locally. Now, you may note that we actually have two different login options. You can log in as a manager or as a developer. So that means we have two dashboards. The developer dashboard is where you're going to log in and develop those new microservices, workflows, BPMs, and so forth, or use the ones that already come from the library. And you're going to test those in a sandbox, make sure everything's okay. And then once you're happy with those developments, you can then promote them to the manager dashboard, where managers can run them in production against real production infrastructure. Now, the development dashboard is out of scope for today's demo, but I just want to mention that to you because it's right there on the login screen. So assuming we've already done the development, what we're now going to do is we're going to execute. So let me log in. So the first thing you see is this circle in the center of the screen. And it's actually telling me that I've got 3 hosts or entities provisioned on this particular install of MS Activator. I have my 2 Dockers that we're going to use in the demo. And I also happen to have a third piece of physical hardware that I'm going to ignore. We can ignore that. So The red on the outside circle, that represents that physical hardware. So the red is telling me that that hardware is offline. The inner circle, the green one, that represents private cloud. So that's naturally where my Dockers live. So that's telling me that it's green. My 2 Dockers are up and running, which is obviously good news because I need them for the demo. And then you can also see there's a gray middle circle. That gray middle circle represents public cloud. So it represents AWS, Azure, stuff like that. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to drill deeper into that. And how I do that is I go into the infrastructure tab. So this infrastructure tab represents that bottom half of the integrated automation platform. So this is where I'm going to go and manage my hosts and apply microservices and so forth. So we can see here's my 3 hosts. I have my red one offline on the bottom, and then I have my 2 Dockers that I'm going to use today. So let me start with the Ansible one. On this screen, I'm looking at the Ansible server at a host level, but I want to drill deeper. So I can go into the configure tab. And in here, I can see the microservices that are attached to this particular host. So I can see I have this Ansible playbook microservice attached. Okay. And if I click on that, we can see this is the playbook that I have in that op playbooks directory that we saw a moment ago on the server itself here. Okay. So naturally, if I had more playbooks on that server, this list would be longer. Now, apart from discovering those playbooks, obviously I can use this microservice to execute the playbooks, and I'm going to show you that in a moment. Before we do that, let's have a look at our other host, which is our Linux one, which is running the firewall. So again, we can drill in deeper. We can go into the configure tab. And what you see here in the configure tab is we've got different microservices attached. So you can see here, depending on your use case, you can apply different microservices to a host to manage the services running on that host. And you can apply as many microservices from the library as you wish. Now, here naturally, we have a simple firewall microservice, which is going to enable us to manage the firewall. And here we can see the policies that's in place on that firewall. Now, if you have a sharp eye, you will note that there's a discrepancy here. So we have one policy in this list, but you'll remember earlier on, we added in a second policy directly via Ansible. So what we need to do is we need to go back and synchronize this. So if I click on synchronize and click OK. So what happens is the import method of that microservice has just been called. It's connected to the firewall, imported in the updated policies back into the MS Activator database. So we can see now we have the second rule down below. So what this shows you is MS Activator is able to discover the configuration changes made by Ansible directly outside of this interface, or indeed any other configuration changes that are made in your environment. Now, what if we want to do that the other way around? Suppose we want to add a third firewall policy, but we want to do it from within this UI. We don't want to leave the UI, we want to do it here. So let's do that next. And in order to do that, we need to run an automation. So naturally, we're going to go to the automation tab. And on this tab, we're dealing with the 2 highest levels of the integrated automation platform. So we have our BPMs and our workflows. I'm going to drill into the workflows. And what it's doing at the moment is it's listing all of the workflows that I have in my particular installation. Because I'm logged in as a super user, I can see everything. So what I need to do is I need to filter that list to just show the workflows that are attached to the host that I'm managing. So I'm going to do this via this subtenant filter. You'll remember early on in the presentation, I spoke about role-based access control, or RBAC. It's via these tenants and subtenants that we achieve that in MS Activator. So if I'm a manager of this particular subtenant, for example, when I log in, this is the screen I will see. I will only see the parts of the infrastructure and the automations that we can apply on that infrastructure that I have permission to see. Okay, so that's how we control that access. Now, getting back to my automation, suppose I want to run a workflow, and this workflow is going to update my firewall. Perfect. So all I need to do is click on the Add Firewall Rule button in the UI. And we see over here, we get this screen. This screen is auto-rendered. So the lower levels of the integrated automation platform understand the capability of the infrastructure that's connected. So for example, in this instance, we know it's a firewall. We know it's expecting to get a port and an IP address as parameters. Depending upon your use case, the parameters can be different. So this screen will auto-render in a different way. Okay, so it's very flexible. It doesn't require any development to do this. It's just something that's built into the framework. Okay, so we want to add another rule. So let's just remind ourselves, we have 2 rules in place. So let's add in a third one, and let's add it in on port 2003. Here it will remember the previous values that I used, so I can just type a new value. I click run. And what's happening now is the orchestration engine in MS Activator is executing the Python code in my workflow. And that workflow in turn is calling the Ansible microservice at the lower level. And it's telling that microservice what playbook to run and what parameters to pass to that playbook. Okay. I can see it's gone green, which is good news. I'm always happy when they go green. That implies that it worked. If it went red, obviously that would imply that there's been some kind of an issue. I can even mouse over this, and you can see that little gray pop-up window. You can actually see the command that we executed on the Ansible server. So we can see the playbook that we executed and the parameters that we passed down. If I X out of this and then go to the history tab, I can see all the previous executions of that particular playbook. I can see the username of the person who ran it. I can see the date and time. And if I click on the details, as before, I can see the actual command that was executed and the parameters that was passed. If I scroll down through this list, I should see some red ones as well. Yep, there you go. So if we had a failure in the past, it will also track that there. We can go back and we can debug. So we have full traceability for all of the automations that's executed within the platform. Now, this is obviously very convenient if, for example, you need to have audit traceability about who done what, which is especially important in a production environment. Now, let's just confirm that that actually worked. So let's go back to our CLI. And if we update the list, we can now see we have a third policy down the bottom on port 2003. Now, normally you wouldn't switch back and forth between the CLI and the host and the UI. I'm just doing this here just because it's a demo. Obviously, it's inconvenient to do that. Instead, what you can do is you can check the results right here within the UI itself. So as before, I can go back to my infrastructure tab, click on my Linux host, click on the configuration tab, click on my simple firewall microservice. And again, as before, you can see we have the 2 rules. What I'm going to do is I'm going to synchronize that, click OK, and we should hopefully see our third rule down the bottom. Okay, perfect. Now I'm doing that synchronization there manually, but obviously you could do that via an API call as well. So I've gone through quite a bit there. I've gone through it quite quickly. So let me recap what we've done. First of all, we showed a brownfield Ansible situation where we had an existing Ansible server, we had some playbooks in place, and obviously we're able to run those directly against the infrastructure. In the second part of the demo, we introduce MS Activator into the equation. And here what we can do is we can start to execute automations and integrations directly within the UI. Now, there's a lot of benefits that come with this. So if we stick with Ansible for a moment, firstly, it means you can execute your Ansible playbooks via a button click in the UI, which is obviously a lot easier for an end user, especially if they don't know Ansible. Secondly, you can call your Ansible playbooks via the REST API as well. Again, that's obviously very convenient. Thirdly, you can integrate your Ansible playbooks into that assurance module that I mentioned earlier. So you can imagine a situation where there's an alarm in the middle of the night and your Ansible playbook is invoked via a workflow to fix that particular issue. Okay, no hands required. So this is where we're getting into automation as magic. And then finally, we have that BPM, visual drag and drop interface. So what that means is if I'm a user who is not an expert, so I don't know anything about Ansible, I can still consume Ansible because I can drag and drop effectively an Ansible playbook into my BPM design, and I can execute that playbook without even knowing that I'm actually using Ansible underneath. Okay, so that's obviously very powerful and very convenient. Now, I'm just doing a time check. That actually concludes my live demo. So let me just switch back to the slides. And that also concludes the presentation that I wanted to give you today. Thanks very much for your attention. And I believe now we can open the floor if we have any questions.
Yeah, thanks very much, John. We do have questions. So starting off with the first one, which comes to us from one of our attendees today. What about supporting other automation tools?
Yeah, great question. Of course, I'm going to say yes. So no surprise there. So that integrated automation platform is flexible enough that we can hug other tools that are out there. So if you want to integrate Chef or Puppet or SaltStack or Terraform or you name it, so long as there's a CLI that we can consume or there's a REST API that we can consume, absolutely we can integrate other tools.
Okay, thanks. Another question we have, can we have a look at the code for the workflow that was run?
Sure, no problem. Let me go back to the UI. I know I wouldn't, I said I wouldn't show you the developer interface, but let me show you real quickly. Okay, so let's have a look at some code, just to give you a flavor for what that looks like. Okay, it would be nice if I remembered my password. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'll go into the automation, select some workflows. So let me just choose a workflow. Okay, so let's take that firewall one. That's a good example. So here we have this big old edit button. We can click here. And what that's going to do is bring you into a workflow designer. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but there's two parts of the workflows. There's the parameters that you can set. So this is where you're going to decide what parameters your workflow is going to accept. And obviously we have support for lots of different data types here. Once you've collected those parameters, either from the UI or from a REST call, you can then pass them down to your scripts. So down here we have a script editor. Here's an example of one here. And here it's basically just Python code, guys. You can, if you know Python or if you know PHP, you're just writing code. Now you remember earlier I mentioned that we have an SDK. So we can see here's some examples of where we're importing some of the Python modules from the SDK. So for example, we have one here for issuing an order to a microservice, one here for handling variables and so on. So I'm not going to go through it line by line, but essentially what this code is doing is it's going to build up a payload, a JSON payload that it's going to pass down to a microservice, and it's going to issue that order to that microservice containing my parameters, and it's going to enable then the microservice to execute that and pass the results back. So there's quite a lot that you can achieve in here, I would say, using the SDK with a minimal amount of coding.
Okay, thanks, John. Another question that's come up is, are we locked into using your microservices?
No, is the short answer. So we would, when you're navigating through those 4 layers, we would recommend that you don't skip one. So for example, you know, from your workflow, it's nicer to call a microservice and let the microservice handle the integration with the infrastructure. The reason why we recommend that is later on, if you need to swap out that microservice with a different microservice, say, for example, you've switched from vendor X to vendor Y, you can switch out the microservices without having to change your automation code. Okay, that's how we handle that decoupling. However, because we're not applying any restrictions, you don't have to use the microservices. So for example, from a workflow, you could call out to a third-party REST API directly. We're not stopping you from doing that. We just don't recommend it.
Another question that was asked, can we see a BPM demo?
I don't actually have one ready to go right now, guys. I'm sorry to say, but I'd be more than happy. If anybody's interested in seeing the BPM, I'd be more than happy to schedule a follow-on and go through that in depth. No issue there.
Great. And another question, can MS Activator provide a playbook edit that is for lifecycle management?
A playbook edit, so the ability to edit the playbook itself?
I believe that was the nature of the question.
The short answer is yes, we can do that. So you can imagine a situation where we could apply that same code editor directly to a playbook. So let me explain what that code editor is doing. It's actually taken code from a Git repository. So it's up to you to configure where your code lives. What we do is we import the code from that Git repository. Now, if you place a playbook inside that Git repository, naturally it's going to start to appear within that interface. So you can edit your playbooks that way directly, but we don't offer the ability to execute the playbook directly. You're still obviously going to have to go via Ansible to execute the playbook. But of course, you can use those microservices that I showed a moment ago.
Okay, thank you. Another question raised is, what do you see as the biggest benefits over Ansible?
Oh, wow. You guys are giving me the easy ones. Biggest benefits over Ansible. Well, let me just say that, you know, Ansible is a great tool. There's a lot of flexibility there. Ansible, if you're using Ansible as it is on the CLI, the benefits are obvious. It makes it easier to use via the UI. You get all those additional benefits like the REST API, the assurance and so on that I explained earlier on. You may be using Tower. Some people are using Tower, which is the UI that you can wrap around that CLI. So if we compare Air Portal to Tower, for example, we can still see some benefits. So Tower also provides a REST API. It also provides obviously a UI and role-based access control. But Tower is very much focused on just Ansible, okay? Tower is not really for managing your infrastructure directly. It's more about managing your playbooks. If you want to do something outside of an Ansible playbook, Tower is not really the tool for you. I think that's the strength in MS Activator. MS Activator has a much broader scope. So we can manage your infrastructure directly, or we can manage it via tools like Ansible. We don't have a hard dependency on Ansible. It's a completely optional thing for you to use. So I think the flexibility there and the broader scope, I think, is really where MS Activator starts to shine.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is with MS Activator, we've got the simplicity there that other automation tools might not have, and definitely the scalability in terms of end-to-end, full lifecycle management.
Exactly.
Another question is, will I get REST APIs to execute the playbooks?
You absolutely will. So I should emphasize that the demo that I gave earlier, when I was clicking the button on the UI to execute the playbook, on the back end, it was actually making a REST call. Our UI is basically just a thin presentation layer. There's no business logic there. All the actual business logic is in the REST API in MS Activator. So the actual thing in that demo that was calling the playbook was a REST API.
Thanks, John. Another question that's come up, integrating playbooks, are they automatic, or is any process or program required to do so?
Well, that's something that we really wanted to nail with that microservice, was the discoverability. We don't want a situation where every time you add a new playbook, you need to go back to MS Activator and do lots of work to configure that. Obviously, that would be quite painful. So the import method of that Ansible microservice that we have, it's going to scan. So if you tell it a directory of playbooks, it's going to scan that on a regular basis. And if you add in a new playbook, it's going to rediscover that playbook automatically, and it's going to inspect inside that playbook to see what kind of parameters that it expects. So the short answer is we have automatic discovery of the playbooks.
Thanks for that, John. Another question that's come in is, are you able to do scheduled workflows?
Yes, absolutely. So the workflows are very flexible. As I mentioned, there's loads of different ways to call them. This is a great question because I actually forgot about the schedule example. So just like a cron, you can schedule a workflow to execute at a certain time or a certain interval, and you can do all that via that management interface in the UI.
Okay, great. Another question that's come through. How can you use an external application to trigger workflows or the BPM using MS Activator's REST API?
So getting into a little bit more detail on that, let me go back to my web app. Actually, it might be easier to show you. So when you install MS Activator, so here I have it installed locally. What you can do is on the same IP address where you have it installed, you'll get access to our Swagger documentation. It'll take a second to load because it's pretty massive. So we have hundreds and hundreds of REST APIs here. And these are naturally what we use to drive our UI. But you can call those APIs directly from anywhere where you can make a connection. So if we take, for example, the auth, naturally that's where somebody is going to do an authentication. They're going to do a login, for example. You can click on that. You can expand. You can see the parameters that's expected. You can see examples of the JSON that's returned. So all of that Swagger documentation, you will get that with the product when you install it.
That's great. Thanks, John. Another question that has come through is, do you plan to integrate AI ops to your platform?
Yeah, great question. So look, I mean, obviously we're very, very active in that integrated automation space. And naturally, when we're talking about automation, the topic of AI is going to come up. So I don't think it would be a big surprise to say that we're looking at AI. We're not looking at AI in the same way as everybody else. Okay, so I can't reveal too much about that, obviously. But the short answer is yes, we are looking at AI. And of course, AI is a natural fit for our automation focus.
Thanks, John. Another question. Assurance, can that be integrated, for example, with playbooks and with the MS Activator? Do you have the ability to do closed loop assurance?
Excuse me. Absolutely. So if you have a playbook that you want to call via assurance, you can have a situation where we can monitor the infrastructure. And when that infrastructure goes from green to red, so you saw the red one on my demo earlier, that can trigger an alarm in our assurance module. And that alarm can be configured to call a workflow that executes your playbook. So absolutely, you can have that full circle where something goes wrong and your playbook gets executed to try to fix that issue.
Thanks. Another question is microservices in MS Activator are developed using PHP code, and is it possible to use Python too?
Actually, that's a great question because microservices are actually not using PHP code. It's something more simple than that. So the way you build up the microservice in the editor is you put in the vendor-specific commands or the API-specific commands in that interface. We save that internally actually as an XML file. Now, you don't see that XML file, but that's how we save it internally in our own repository. But from an end user perspective, developing and configuring a microservice is all via that UI in the developer dashboard, and it doesn't require any PHP or Python for that matter.
Great, thanks for that. Another question that's come through is how easy is it to set up MS Activator?
Yeah, that's something that we've really focused on very, very heavily in 2020 in particular, was making the ease of use of the installation as easy as possible. And that's one of the lessons that we learned from the, that previous generation of tools when we talked about the Ansible user at the beginning, a low barrier to entry. We want a low barrier to entry as well. So how we've achieved that is we have a quick start version of MS Activator, and you can actually download that from ubcube.com. You'll see a link there to download a free trial. That quick start is basically a series of Docker containers that we host on Docker Hub. So with a couple of commands, if you're familiar with Docker, anywhere where you can run Docker, you can run that quick start environment. And that's exactly what I ran for the demo today, by the way, guys. I was using the quick start. So everything that I ran today, you can download that, you can play around with it in your lab, and the installation is pretty easy. You just need to follow the few steps on the website.
Great, thanks for that. And just to let people know, we just have a few more minutes left for questions. So another question that's come through is, can I run a workflow using the results of other workflows? And also part of that is it easy to define such a workflow? Example, a combination of existing workflows.
Yeah, guys, yeah, you're really asking some great questions today. Fair play. So yes, we have thought about that one too. We have this concept in the workflow engine and also in the BPM of context. So we have a context that we can pass from one workflow to the second or third one. Now, what that means is you can execute a task in a workflow, you can store the results of that task in the context, and then the second workflow task can pick up that context and use that as input into its task. So you can imagine how you can chain your executions that way, and that context can be passed along that chain until it's completed.
Another question that's come through is, can we see demos of other use cases?
Yes, of course you can. More than happy to schedule any follow-ons. So feel free to reach out. We're always available to schedule demos. If there's a particular use case that you're interested in seeing, we can drill into that and we can show you more detail. Absolutely.
Great. Thanks for that, John. I see that we're approaching the top of the hour. So I'd just like to say to all the participants today that thank you very much for joining us on this call. And if you have any follow-up questions, we'd be more than happy to answer those. And as John said, we can set up separate calls to address other use cases or answer any other questions that you might have. More than happy to do so. You can find more documentation from our website. That's ubcube.com that you can just type into your browser. And as John mentioned, you're also able to download a free trial from our website. So please make use of that functionality. At any rate, thanks very much, John. It's been a very informative session. And I want to thank you for answering all those questions today and for your presentation on the demo. And as I mentioned at the start of this call, we are looking to schedule further webinars. So we'll keep you posted on that, and do look for any updates to our various media feeds and on our website for that. So thanks everyone for attending. I really appreciate your time today, and we look forward to seeing and speaking to everyone soon. Thanks again.
Thanks a lot, guys. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.